I am the Philosophical Bachelor, and today I want to talk about Schelling's philosophy of nature. Science was in the midst of a modern transformation during Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph von Schelling's time. Born in 1775, the physics of his day was dominated by Isaac Newton's mechanics, which was formulated just in the previous century. Schelling will touch on a wide range of physical subjects in his Ideas for a Philosophy of Nature, published in 1797, such as chemistry, air, combustion, light, electricity, and magnetism, and draw a common metaphysical thread through them all. These were then still not well understood and did not have a unifying principle. Schelling was, in effect, trying to formulate a theory of everything for science that scientists today are still attempting to do. While the science of Schelling's day has been overtaken, his search for the underlying principles behind nature is still ongoing today and can hold valuable lessons for metaphysicians. In addition to philosophy, Schelling studied medicine, physics, and mathematics in order to formulate this Naturphilosophie, or philosophy of nature. Already, this may be the first lesson from him, that we have to be acquainted with the present day's best science to be able to think through its consequences and take it into account when philosophizing. Despite what some scientists and even philosophers may think, science requires a metaphysical foundation. Even when scientists think they are doing only science, they are relying on metaphysical suppositions, knowingly or worse, unknowingly. Let us begin with what matter is. Newton's conception of matter was that it was made of hard, impenetrable, inert atoms which moved only when acted upon by external forces. Drawing on Immanuel Kant's Metaphysical Foundations of Natural Science, published in 1786, Schelling saw nature as a sphere of polarity and dualism, a balance between opposing forces, hence making his account of seemingly static matter dynamic. Robert Stern, who wrote the introduction to the English translation by Errol E. Harris and Peter Heath, published in 1988, explains that when this balance is disrupted, strife and activity follows. Inanimate matter and non-living things are in a state of inertia when there is an equilibrium of forces. An object at rest is simply its forces in equilibrium. In fact, Schelling sees these forces as what is fundamental in things, as opposed to the materialist view which considers matter and its atoms as more fundamental. In living things, these forces are in continuous disequilibrium, which is what gives rise to its activity. Matter and bodies are themselves nothing but products of opposing forces, or rather are themselves nothing else but these forces, he writes. Attractive and repulsive forces constitute the essence of matter itself. Schelling's theory of forces opposes the dominant paradigm of materialism, where all phenomena is explained as the interaction of material bodies, including combustion, light, magnetism, and electricity, which all had their associated matter such as caloric for heat, which is a fluid heat stuff, light stuff for light, magnetic stuff for magnetism, and electric stuff for electricity. Today we understand these four phenomena as energy, but at that time, these were explained by leading scientists and thinkers in material terms, that they are constituted by matter. In addition, since the transmission of forces seemingly requires contact between bodies, the transmission of gravitational force was posited to depend on ether, a material medium of minute particles moving in all directions at high velocity in all parts of space. Schelling rejects the ether hypothesis because it leaves the ether's purported particles and their motion unexplained, and because his dynamic conception of matter renders such theories redundant. One of Schelling's aim in ideas was to develop a philosophy of chemistry. According to his theory, qualities of matter arise from the disequilibrium of its constituting forces. Schelling posits two primary qualities: elasticity, which is associated with the repulsive force, and mass, which is associated with the attractive force. All other qualities or properties, such as color and temperature, depend on these primary qualities. Some scientists in his time explained how chemical reactions take place in terms of the ether or through gravitational attraction, but Schelling argues that reactions occur between bodies due to the opposing degrees of their basic forces. Forces have differing degrees or intensities. The way to initiate a chemical reaction is to first upset the equilibrium of the basic forces of the individual reactants. For instance, a body with a high degree of repulsive force and hence a low degree of attractive force can easily react with another with a low degree of repulsive force and a high degree of attractive force. Both such bodies have an impetus to combine so as to restore their imbalance of basic forces to an equilibrium. The product of the reaction will have a median of the basic forces of the two bodies. As Stern notes, Schelling's theory leads to some strange views, such as how his paradigmatic chemical reaction is between a solid and a fluid body, since solids have a high degree of attractive force, while fluids a high degree of repulsive force. However, while Schelling's theory is today outdated, Stern points out that his account is closer than the Newtonians to our contemporary understanding of chemical affinity in terms of opposed electrical charge. To appreciate how groundbreaking Schelling's work must have been in his time, consider how oxygen was discovered only in 1772. Schelling was working in the early days of modern chemistry. On combustion, Schelling rejects the then prevailing caloric theory of heat, which treats heat as a fluid called caloric that chemically combines with a body when it is warmed. He writes, "To postulate a heat matter, or caloric, as the cause of heat is not to explain the situation, but to pay oneself with words." He recognizes that while a material explanation, which postulates a substance with a property that it then imparts to other bodies, may be useful, even mathematically precise, it still remains only a scientific fiction on which to base experiments and observations as regulative, but not explanations and hypotheses as principle. Schelling's theory is that heat is simply a particular degree of repulsive or expansive force possessed by a heated body, which may be communicated to another body until equilibrium is restored. Heat does not chemically react with the heated body, though it can aid chemical reactions, since it may upset the body's prior equilibrium by increasing the repulsive force in it, allowing it to combine with another body with more attractive force. Similarly on light, scientific theories in his day posit a light stuff which chemically reacts with other matter. For Schelling, light is instead the highest degree of the repulsive or expansive force. In contrast with heat, which expansive force can be possessed by any state of matter, that is, solid, liquid, or gas, only air or gases is able to carry light. Schelling also applies his theory of equilibrium to air. Vital air, or oxygen given off by plants, is balanced by the exhalation by animals of mephitic air, or carbon dioxide. He notes the presence of azotic air, or nitrogen, and how the proportions of all these in atmospheric air support life. He rejects other scientific theories of his day, such as how the components of air are separated into layers, arguing rightly instead that they must be chemically mixed. On electricity, Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment in 1752 demonstrates that lightning consists of electricity, though static electricity had already been observed around 600 BCE by Thales of Miletus, who rubbed amber with fur. Alejandro Volta invented the first electric battery in 1800. Schelling's theory of polarity fits well with today's ideas on what electricity is. He rejects Franklin's notion that electricity was a subtle elastic fluid, considering once again the materialist account as lazy, since such an explanation was question-begging, assuming what it instead should be proving. Schelling argues that positive electricity is due to the elasticity of matter, while negative electricity is due to the mass in matter, in keeping with his views of the primary qualities of matter where elasticity is associated with the repulsive force and mass is associated with the attractive force. He links the attractive force with oxygen, which empirically seems to intensify cohesion, and hence deduces that the electrical properties of bodies depends on their oxidizability. As for magnetism, similar materialist arguments were made for the existence of magnetic stuff as the explanation for magnetism. Though Schelling rejects them, Stern tells us that Schelling offers little by way of an alternative explanation of the magnetic properties of bodies. By now, you may be wondering where Schelling's postulated forces come from. Schelling thinks that the answer to this is outside the domain of empirical science and possible experience, and hence needs to be a metaphysical one. In the first edition of Ideas, Schelling draws on Johann Gottlieb Fichte's dialectic in his Wissenschafter Lehre, or Doctrine of Knowledge, and Kant's Transcendental Idealism. Fichte was trying to discover the conditions that make objective knowledge possible, which would then be the primordial, absolutely unconditioned first principle of all human knowledge. He uses logic. The principle of identity in logic states that A is A. However, the former A is not the same as the latter A, since the former A is the subject while the latter A is a predicate. Since A equals to A, I equals to I. While there is a unity of the I, the self as subject in recognizing its own subjectivity also sees itself as an object. Next, Fichte considers the principle of non-contradiction in logic, which states that not A is not equal to A. In awakening to our subjectivity and hence simultaneously also realizing our objectivity, we then realize that there is a world apart from ourselves, which is not us or the not-self. The not-self is not equal to the self. The two terms are in opposition, but according to Schelling, this opposition is not a mutual negation and destruction. Instead, the terms are mutually limiting. This leads us to Fichte's third principle. In the self, I oppose a divisible not-self to the divisible self. The self and the not-self are opposed, but require each other, mutually determining each other by posing limits to each other, leading to a synthesis. While Schelling accepts this, he is puzzled by how an objective world can ever give rise to our subjectivity, since causal interactions between us and things can explain reactive motion, but not subjective sensations, feelings, or thoughts. Today, this is known as the hard problem of consciousness related to qualia. To tackle this, Schelling begins from consciousness as the fundamental self. He posits, all thinking and presentation in us is necessarily preceded by an original activity, which because it precedes all thinking, is to that extent absolutely undetermined and unconfined. Even prior to thinking, our consciousness must already be active. The I, self or consciousness, must hence first exist before it can have any thoughts and perceptions. In itself and for itself, it is unlimited since there is nothing to limit it. However, once the self becomes conscious of the external world, this external world appears as an opposing element to the self, as the not-self. It then limits or restricts our consciousness, since what is presented is no longer undetermined and unconfined, but determinate and hence confined. It is these opposing mutually restrictive activities that make thought or intuition of an object possible. While he is considered a German idealist, Schelling admits that objects are extra-mental, and there is a co-determination between the object and our consciousness of the object. According to Kant, the object acts on our sensory apparatus, and the sensory data from the apparatus is interpreted by our cognition to represent the object to our consciousness. More poignantly, when an object acts on us, what acts is not its material form, but the force it exerts, according to Schelling. The object presents an opposing force to our consciousness, which is how we can even intuit it. Our intuition then perceives these forces as forces attaching to the object in itself, without any reference to a possible cognition. What we sense are forces and not the object itself. However, our consciousness mediates the sensory data of these forces into an interpretation which tells us of an object. Since we understand the processes of our consciousness, which in Schelling's case is Kant's account of it, if we can undo the interpretive work of our consciousness, we then get to what is real. When we uninterpret, we come to realize, as Schelling did, that what we refer to as objects are in fact only forces. Objects are just our mental construction of forces, a useful fiction but nonetheless a fiction. From this, Schelling extrapolates how such opposition of forces are found everywhere in nature. In the 8 years between the two editions of Ideas, Schelling's thoughts have morphed into a philosophy of identity. In the first edition, he was influenced by Fichte's dialectic and its duality, but by the second edition in 1803, his philosophy of nature became centered on the Neoplatonic conception of the absolute, with duality arising from a primordial unity which unfolds into difference and multiplicity. The absolute is a homogeneous and undifferentiated Parmenidean-like totality. Since it is the total and is infinite, if there is any change, this change cannot come from outside it because there is nothing outside it. Change, if any, must arise internally. While the absolute is static in its entirety, it is not static internally. Duality arises within itself when itself divides into subject and object. These opposites are then reconciled back to unity while preserving their difference. The structure of this movement is replicated in each thing. Schelling provides another way of viewing this theory. In the absolute, there is the infinite and undifferentiated essence, a unity which becomes differentiated in forms which are determinate and limited, giving us a multiplicity comprised of finite forms. The absolute, since it includes all, unifies this multiplicity of limited and finite forms with the unity of the infinite essence, uniting them in an absolute unity. Stern explains, the absolute is the unity of the twofold movement of unity into difference, or universal into particular, or infinite into finite, and difference into unity, or particular into universal, or finite into infinite. This eternal division into subject and object, into unity and difference, is what sets off the polarity in nature. In conclusion, Schelling was in search of principles that will explain all of nature. The ancient Greeks called such a principle arche. His principle is that everything is made up of attractive and repulsive forces. He observed empirically that this principle can be applied coherently to matter and various natural phenomena such as magnetism, air, electricity, light, combustion, and chemistry. He hence rejects materialism, considering it incoherent since it begs the question, by postulating stuff for each property it is supposed to instead be explaining, thereby presupposing what it instead is supposed to prove. He derived this principle in 3 ways. The first is via Fichte's dialectical principles, where the self and its opposition, not self, mutually limit each other. He believes that this opposition and mutual limitation, this duality, extends to all things and their phenomena, hence giving rise to attractive and repulsive forces. He moved away from Fichte's teachings subsequently, and by the time of the second edition of his ideas in 1803, his philosophy has shifted to a philosophy of identity, where the totality of all things is an absolute. Duality arises when the absolute recognizes itself, hence self-dividing into subject and object. They are identical, but yet they are different. Such opposition extends throughout nature, and the collective sum of all things in nature and their differences form a unity. The third way is another way of talking about the absolute. The absolute is an infinite and undifferentiated essence. This essence, however, instantiates itself in a multiplicity of forms, which are each determinate and hence limited. Yet these forms and the essence are unified in the absolute. There is a duality of unity and multiplicity, universal and particular, infinite and finite, which is the unlimited and the limited, and difference and identity. This duality is manifest in nature, translating to opposing forces, which find unification in equilibrium and hence stability. While Schelling did not state this explicitly, he implicitly posits that all things want to go towards a stable equilibrium state. I would like to venture an explanation. I had stated it as if things had a panpsychic or teleological desire towards equilibrium and stability, but Schelling does not imply this, at least in ideas. He may, however, agree that the movement of all things, be it through dialectical or absolute idealism, is a movement towards a synthesis or unity. While today's chemistry does not discuss reactions in terms of forces, it does do so in terms of energy or enthalpy, with the reduction of enthalpy or increased thermodynamic stability serving as the impetus that makes reactions possible. That will be the scientific or physical explanation, but the metaphysical reason why will be this movement towards synthesis or unity. As a final comment, the idea of forces as fundamental may arguably be transmuted to a closely related associate of force, energy, since there is a linear relation where energy equals to force times distance between them. Quantum field theory, a current leading theory of physics, proposed that energy is more fundamental than the elementary particles in physics. As Schelling has already posited 2 centuries before, objects are just forces. As quantum field theory posits, the elementary particles are just quantized energy. From that point of view, Schelling's naturphilosophy may be considered rather prescient in its interpretation of natural phenomena and matter, not in terms of substance, but in terms of forces and hence energy, making ideas an important work in process metaphysics in German idealism. Thank you for listening to the Philosophical Bachelor.